Section 44 of the Treatises of Benvenuto Cellini on Goldsmithing and Sculpture by Benvenuto Cellini, translated by C.R. ASHBEE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Treatise on Sculpture, Chapter 7. A Disquisition on Colossal Statues, whether moderately or very great. Most gracious of readers, forasmuch as I have always promised to illustrate my words with instances from my own created works, I would like now to tell you of another branch of the subject, and one that is both the most difficult and the most admirable of any so far described. Allow me then to make the following digression, so that those who read may have means of pondering it well. I mean Colossi. Not necessarily the very great ones, because whenever a statue is 3 times bigger than life-size, it may be termed a colossus. I have seen plenty of such, both ancient and modern, but of the very great ones I have only seen one, and that was in Rome. It was in many pieces, and I saw the head, feet, part of the legs, and other fragments of its great limbs. Upon measuring the head, which was standing upright and without the neck, I found as I stood alongside it that it came up to my nipples, so that it would measure more than 2½ Florentine cubits. The complete statue, therefore, must have been about 20 cubits high. When I served the great King Francis, it must have been about the year 1540, knowing his consummate taste and his delight in everything rare and masterful, knowing, too, that such an object had never yet been fashioned by any living artist, I made among the other works before mentioned a model for a fountain at Fontainebleau, or, as one might translate it, Fontana Bellio, the fountain of fine waters. This model was square in form, and in the middle of the square was a square base rising 4 cubits above the water. It was richly ornamented with many pleasing designs, and devices appropriate to the king and to the fountain. Upon the base was a figure representing the god Mars, and at the 4 corners were figures having reference, all of them, to his majesty. When I showed it to the king it was to a smaller scale, but in its full size the central figure would have been 40 cubits high, the side figures being proportionately smaller. When the king saw the model, he examined it a long while with the greatest satisfaction, and then asked me of the central figure. It was a god of war, I said, and hence most appropriate to his majesty. Then he asked me of the other figures. They represented, I said, the 4 virtues in which he especially delighted. Just as the central figure betokened the glory of arms, so did this one at the corner represent the glory of letters, this one again sculpture, painting and architecture, the next music and every sort of musical harmony, while the last personified liberality, the cause, mainspring and foster-mother of all the other virtues, and one that was most abundant in his majesty. His majesty promptly gave me the commission to proceed with the work, which I did, inspired by his delightful encouragement and with abundance of all sorts of things placed at my service. After the careful completion of my little model, as it did not seem to me possible to retain all the proper proportions if I worked direct from it into the full size, I determined to make another model 3 times the size of the small one, about the stature of a well-formed man, therefore. This model I made in gesso, so that it should the better resist the much handling that is inevitable from frequent measuring. After setting up the iron skeleton, I covered it with gesso, and finished it beautifully, putting more care and detail into it than the little one. I would take this opportunity, gentle reader, of bidding you bear in mind that all the really great masters have followed life, but the point is that you must have a fine judgment to know how the best of life is to be put into your work. You must always be on the lookout for beautiful human beings, and from among them choose the most beautiful, and not only so, you must from among even these choose the most beautiful parts, and so shall your whole composition become an abstraction of what is beautiful. So alone may work be created that shall be evident at once as the labour of men both exquisite in judgment and humble in study. Such men are rare. Now, such zeal had I, and so many conveniences were placed at my service by that most liberal King Francis, that I brought this 3-sized model of mine to completion. Not only was I satisfied with it myself, but it pleased everybody who knew what good work was. Truly great art is infinite, and the more study you put into your work, the easier it is for you to see its blemishes than others. But for all that, it is sometimes good to cry, "Hold, enough," even to one's own work. So meseemed here, I thought, to content me, and therefore I arranged for setting my work up in due order from the scale model to the final 40 cubits. This was how I went about it. End of section 44. Section 45 of the Treatises of Benvenuto Cellini on Goldsmithing and Sculpture by Benvenuto Cellini, translated by C.R. ASHBEE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Treatise on Sculpture, Chapter 8, The Mystery of Making Great Colossi. To begin with, then, I divided the model, which was to be translated from 3 cubits to 40, into 40 small parts. Each of these parts again I divided into 24 parts. But as I knew that this model alone would not suffice to arrive at the requisite size, I devised another method, a method entirely my own, never invented by anyone before, and the outcome of my own great researches. As I am always generously inclined, I will impart it to such as have good work at heart. It is this. I took 4 square pieces of wood measuring respectively 3 fingers each way. They were very straight, and planed nice and smooth, and they were exactly the height of my figure. These I fixed into the ground, plumbing them absolutely straight, and at such distance from the figure as to admit of a man entering in between. They were then matchboarded all round. Soppanata. The boards being likewise perfectly straight, and a small opening at the back to enter by. Up against this matchboarding I began making my measurements, and then I drew out on the floor of a long room a profile (profilo) of the whole statue, 40 cubits in size. Finding this plan work out with delightful accuracy, I proceeded next to make a skeleton 3 cubits high, similar to that of the model. This skeleton was all joined together with pieces of wood, fastened respectively to a very straight rod. The latter served for the left leg, upon which my figure rested. I took the measurements of the body of the figure off the case, making allowance in doing so for the thickness of the flesh and bonework it had subsequently to be clothed with. Thereupon I erected a great mast 40 cubits high in the centre of the court of my castle, and round it I set up 4 other masts, just as I had done with a model, and these also I cased round with matchboarding just as I had done the small model. Then I joined together the life-size skeleton, taking the measurements exactly from the small skeleton, for every little piece a large piece, and so marking off every measurement of every part of my figure proportionately from one case onto the other. Had I scaled the work off in the usual way, I should have had no end of difficulties, but this method of mine, with the cases, avoided all that, and I got as fine a proportion in my life-size as in my small figures. Now, as my figure was posed upon the left foot, and had the right foot resting on a helmet, so I arranged the skeleton as to make it possible to get inside the helmet and climb easily through the foot right up into the head. The skeleton completed, I clothed it in flesh, that is to say, in gesso, and laid it on rapidly in the same manner. When I had got the work completed to the last skin but one, I had the front of the casing opened, and stepped back to view it some 40 cubits, which was as much as there was room for in my courtyard. Everybody was delighted with the result, not only connoisseurs, many of whom came to see, but, what was much more important, I myself, who had given so much labour towards its fulfilment. What pleased me most, however, was the fact that there was not the slightest discrepancy between the small and the large model. By this method of mine I set working a number of labourers and people unskilled in the profession. It wasn't in the least necessary for them to know what they were doing. Indeed, so masterly is my invention that nothing but patience and diligence are needed. For the rest, you may be a perfect ignoramus in the art, and not even the hand of a Michelangelo help you. In a colossus of this kind, the masses of muscle, etc., are so huge that it is impossible to take them in from the ordinary point of vision, which one may put at twice the length of a man. And if you approach the figure at arm's length in order to work it, you see nothing. If, on the other hand, you go a long way off, you do see a little more, but still not enough to remedy the great errors that must arise. You see, therefore, that without this method of mine, it is impossible to carry out a large colossus with fine proportions. Truly, many a statue of 10 cubits high has been spoilt by some blunder or other, and I really think that not even statues of 6 cubits high can be properly made without this method of mine. Of course, it is quite conceivable that just as I have discovered this method, so some greater genius than I may discover a better one still. But then, it's always easy to improve a patent. When the king came to Paris, he lay, as was his wont, at his castle, the Logro, the Louvre. It was opposite my castle of Little Nello, for there was only the Seine in between. I crossed the river and waited upon his majesty. He was quite charming to me, and asked me if I had anything lovely to show him. I replied that as for the loveliness, I wasn't so sure, but I had done some work with great study and with all the devotion that so noble an art demanded, and that, if it was good, it was due to him who allowed me to want for nothing, such free-handedness being the only way of getting the best work done. To this the king yea said me, and the day following he came to my house. After I had shown him a variety of different work, I made him enter the courtyard, placing him at the point whence my great statue told to the best advantage. He obeyed me with the greatest condescension and the most perfect breeding. Footnote. Virtue. See also Brinkmann's rendering, als größere Liebhaber der schönen Künste. End footnote. And indeed, never have I met any prince who had such a wonderful way with him. Now, while I was conversing with his majesty, I ordered Ascanio, my pupil, to let the curtain down. Instantly the king raised his hands and spoke in my praise the most complimentary words that human tongue ever uttered. After which, turning to Monseigneur d'Annibal, footnote, Claude d'Annebaut, Maréchal de France, end footnote. I command you, he said most emphatically, to give the first good fat abbey that falls vacant to our Benvenuto, for I do not want my kingdom to be deprived of his like. At this I bowed deeply and thanked the king, while he, well satisfied, went back to his castle. Now knew I what pleasure my labour caused this great king. Encouragement brought encouragement, and I set to yet greater labours still. I took 30 pounds of silver of my own money, and gave it to 2 of my workmen, with the designs and the models to make 2 large vases of it. As it was a time of great wars, I had asked no money of the king, and also left untouched 6 months of my salary. Setting to work lustily at my own vases, I finished them in a month's time, and set out with them to find the king, who was in a city by the sea called Argentana. When I gave him the vases, he was most engaging, and said, "Be of good heart, my Benvenuto, for I am one that both can and will reward your labours better than anyone else in the world." To which I replied that from earliest recollections my mightiest labours had been the discovery and application of my method relating to the founding of great Colossi, that now, thanks to God, my model had come up to my expectations, that the casting had now to be considered, and that this would have to be done in over 100 separate pieces, fitted together with swallow-tail joints. nor would it be very difficult for us to do, as I had already devised a skeleton of iron upon which to attach the various portions of the Colossus as I cast them, commencing at the feet and piece by piece fitting them together up to the head. The only difficulty would be the putting together of the iron skeleton, but this too I would take credit for surmounting, observing the same process as I had carried out previously in the wooden one. It would be necessary then for me to fix the first rods of the skeleton straightway into their final position, that is to say, at His Majesty's residence at Fontainebleau, where I should have to be provided with a room sufficiently large for the purpose. To this the king replied that, if there were no other rooms suitable to my purpose, he would give up to me his own private apartment, so great was his desire to see a work of this kind finished. I might take courage then, and be of a light heart, and, he added, I might return to Paris to this end. The two big vases were standing on the table before His Majesty, and as he was fingering and praising them, I preferred the request to him that, as the time was opportune, it being the time of war, he would grant me permission to return for 4 months to Italy, to revisit my fatherland, my relatives and friends. At these words of mine His Majesty grew very sour of aspect, and turned to me, saying, "I wish you to gild these 2 vases from top to bottom with dull gilding." This remark he repeated twice, and then he rose quickly from the table and said nothing further. By dull I fancied he meant 2 things. Firstly, that I was a dull fool to ask such a liberty, and secondly, that the gold on the vases was to be left unburnished. When His Majesty had withdrawn, I begged the Cardinal of Ferrara, to whom was entrusted the duty of looking after me, to procure the leave for me. The Cardinal bade me go back to Paris, and that he would let me know what I should do. In the space of a fortnight he sent word by one of his servants that I could go, but that I should return as soon as possible. I praised God and set out. Of the property in my castle I took absolutely nothing with me, neither the stuffs, nor the house furniture, the silver, nor the gold, nor the embossed vases, nor any of the other things made independently of the agreements entered into with the king, works all of them carried out by my workmen and paid for by me. The great works enumerated in this book, and made for the king, His Majesty had himself valued at over 16,000 scudi. I not unnaturally thought that, as I had not only taken nothing, but was likewise a creditor for so large a treasure, I should come back quick enough. So I came to Italy and reached Florence, my native city, and went to Poggio in Caiano, and shook hands with the Grand Duke Cosimo, and he received me very charmingly. 2 days after, the Grand Duke gave me an order to make a small model for a Perseus, which was most gratifying to me, and 2 months sufficed to do it in. When His Excellency saw it, he was beyond measure pleased, and he said to me in the presence of a number of gentlemen, "Had you the courage to carry out the work as finely in a great piece as here in your little model, it would be the grandest work on the piazza." To these gratifying words I replied, "My lord, in the piazza are works by Donatello and the great Michelangelo, both of them men that in the glory of their works have beaten the ancients. As for me, I have the courage to execute this work to the size of 5 cubits, and in so doing make it ever so much better than the model." At this there was no end of argumentation. Now, as the war was still raging hotly in France, I thought I should have plenty of time to cast one at least of the 2 figures. (Footnote: the Perseus and the Medusa.) End footnote. But when they heard in France that I was working in Florence for the Grand Duke Cosimo, His Majesty took it very ill indeed, and he said on several occasions, "Didn't I tell Benvenuto that he was a dull fool?" Upon which the Cardinal of Ferrara did me a bad turn and made matters worse, so that in the end the king said he would never call me back again. All this was notified to me in writing on behalf of the king. To this I replied that what alone troubled me was leaving so great a work unfinished, but that I should never think of going anywhere where I wasn't called. And so it came about that what with the encouragement of His Excellency I set to work to get my Perseus through. After some time, it must have been several months, the king relented, and, discussing the matter with the Cardinal of Ferrara, said to him that it had been a great mistake ever to have let me go. The cardinal replied that it needed but a wink to fetch me back again. To this the king said that it was the cardinal's duty to have prevented it, and instantly turning to one of his treasurers, by name Giuliano Buonaccorsi, one of our Florentines, said to him, "Send Benvenuto 6,000 scudi, and tell him to come back and finish his great Colossus, and I'll make it up with him." The treasurer wrote to me all about His Majesty's making it up, but he didn't send any coin, saying, however, that upon hearing my reply he would at once give the order for the money. To this, I, on my part, replied that I was quite ready and would make it up too. In the midst of these negotiations to and fro, the good king departed this life. Thus was I deprived of the glory of my great work, the reward of all my labours, and of everything that I left behind me. So I set to work to finish my Perseus. End of the Treatise on Sculpture. End of section 45. End of the Treatises of Benvenuto Cellini on Goldsmithing and Sculpture by Benvenuto Cellini, translated by C. R. Ashby.